Hi, this is Mark with LearnToProgram.tv. This free tutorial video is about Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript, and XML. You've probably heard of Ajax, and Ajax is a type of JavaScript code that allows you to update the user's page or the user's view without having to refresh the whole page like you do when you click a link. It's actually an important technology that's behind a lot of websites these days. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up my site here, and I'm going to add to that baseball.php. What I have on www.learntoprogram.tv/baseballphp is kind of a fake web service. You'll notice every time I click refresh, the scores actually update. They're just randomized scores. So you can actually have a tie, which isn't really true in baseball, but regardless, as long as the Yankees win, I'm pretty happy. So this is a fake service called on learntoprogram.tv. And you can use that address too if you try your own simple Ajax example. All right, so this is a simple Ajax example. What we're going to do is we're going to have the content from that website fill in this div, which we're going to call scores. A div, of course, is a logical division, just kind of a storage place for some content in your page. And we're going to have that content come live from the server without refreshing the entire page. And we'll have the access of that data, or the retrieval of that data, I should say, queued through a input type button. So a button that'll be on the screen. And we'll make the value of that get scores. And then we'll create an onClick event, which we'll call the getScores function, which we haven't written yet, but we will write in just a moment. So let me add a break here so this appears exactly where I want. Let's just take a quick look in the preview in my text editor, make sure this looks how I anticipated. Get scores, yep, and we don't see the div because we haven't put any content in it. All right, so that's the simple part, setting up the HTML. Let's set up the JavaScript. So I'll insert my JavaScript tags, script language equals JavaScript, type equals text/JavaScript, and then our closing script tag below that. So now in here, to do any type of Ajax, I've got to create a specific type of object that manages the Ajax interactions. That object is called the XML HTTP request object. So let's create that and set that to a local variable name. We'll call this just XML HTTP for short, and that's a new XML HTTP request object. So now, because this is an object, XML HTTP, our reference to that object, has all of the methods that are part of the XML HTTP request and all of the properties that are part of the XML HTTP request. And that's called XML HTTP locally. So now, the actual object is going to make the request of our remote server. So there's two parts to that. First, there's XML HTTP.open. Now the open actually has two required arguments, but I use three. The first is the method, and that's always going to be get or post. We're going to use get because that's what the web service, the fake web service that we're going to be contacting expects. The second argument is the URL. So the URL is http://www.learntoprogram.tv, which is exactly where we got the scores before in the web browser. And then the third argument is whether or not you would like to have the XML HTTP object work asynchronously. And we do. We want the user to be able to do other things while it's retrieving the data. So we want this to be an asynchronous interaction. That's why it's called Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. All right. And now we're going to call XML HTTP.send. All right. So we have our open and our send command. Now, we need to be actually monitoring the XML HTTP request object. And the reason for that is we don't know quite how long this particular interaction with the server is going to take. As you know, when you click to load something from a server, it could take a few seconds, it could take just 1 second, or somewhere in between. So we've got to be monitoring this object and waiting for the server to return some data. When it does, a property of the XML HTTP request object called the ready state property changes in value. That ready state property has actual 4 values, which I'll talk about in just a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to set XML HTTP dot on ready state change. Now, what that is a listener. And what it's doing is it's actually listening for the ready state property of the XML HTTP request object to change. When that ready state changes, we're going to run this particular anonymous function. You notice I gave this function no name. It only runs when the onReadyStateChange event fires. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to test the ready state, XML HTTP colon, and we're going to make sure the ready state is 4. If it's 4, we know that that's the response we're looking for. Now we also want to check and make sure that the status that came back is 200. You may have heard of these HTTP statuses before. You may have gotten a 404 error, right? A 404 error means page not found. Well, 200 just means okay. Now, by the way, when it comes to these statuses, there are 4 of them, and you should be aware of them. I'm going to put those in comments here. So the first one, actually there's 5. 0 counts, I guess. That status means that the request to the server has not been initialized yet, so the request hasn't started. Status 1 is one of the intermediary steps, and that means we are connected to the server. Status 2 means that the server has received our request. Status 3 means that the server is processing. And status 4 means that the request is finished and data is ready. So obviously, we're going to be looking for status 4 right here, when the ready state's in status 4. When ready state is in status 4, we're going to again deal with this div down here. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the div, and we're going to set the inner HTML property of the div to the response. So document.getElementById. And the element ID that we're getting, of course, is going to be the ID of the div, which is scores, dot inner HTML equals, and then we're going to get the response from the XML HTTP object. Now, there's 2 types of response objects. There's response text and response XML. In this simple example, we're only dealing with a plain text response, so we're going to do response text. In a more complicated example, we probably would get XML back. Most web services return XML, and then we'd have to use the response XML property. All right, so that should fill the data into our actual div once the data returns. Now, it might be nice to deal with the intermediate steps and give the user a little feedback. Get element by ID, scores. So what I'm going to do is, if we don't have a 4 and a 200, I'm just going to put in that particular box, waiting for server response. Probably in the real world, we want to put something a little friendlier, like waiting for scores, but that'll work for our purposes. All right, so let's review how this works one more time. First, we're going to load the XML HTTP request object, and we're going to make a reference to that called XML HTTP. We're then going to set up the onReadyStateChange event listener. When that event occurs and the ready state changes, we're going to fire a function. It's an anonymous function. All that function is going to do is check if the ready state is 4 and the XML HTTP.status is 200. Then we're going to run document getElementById scores. That's that div element. We're going to set the inner HTML to the response text that came back in the object. If that's not the case, then we're going to put in that div waiting for server response. Now, when you're testing this type of thing, if you're using a PC, you're generally going to want to test an Internet Explorer. The reason is many browsers won't allow this type of cross-site scripting, where we're running a script on our domain but getting the data from this domain. That can be a security vulnerability. So you can only test in Internet Explorer with the specific security settings that allow that. Some browsers don't allow it at all. If you're using a Mac, you're going to want to test on Safari. Oh, and before I run it in the web browser, I see one mistake that I made here. I need to wrap this whole thing in the get scores function. Some of you were probably wondering why I didn't do that, and the reason is because I forgot. I don't have a much better reason than that. All right, so now this will run when the getScores function is called. All right, and let's save, and let's try this in Safari. And we'll click Get Scores. And you saw very quickly there it says waiting for server response, and then it got the scores. Let's try it again. So we're communicating with the server behind the scenes. We're not having to refresh the entire page and using Ajax to get data from a simulated web service. I hope you will follow me on one of the social networks or visit my site at learntoprogram.tv.